Billionaire was packing for a new life, until a photo of his ex-wife and their newborn fell out. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from, and once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. The mahogany desk bore the weight of another victory. Merritt Easton, 38, and sharp as the Italian suits that lined his walk-in closet, signed the final page of the Geneva contract with the same mechanical precision he applied to everything else in his life. His steel-gray eyes reflected no satisfaction, only the cold calculation that had built his automotive design empire from a college dorm room sketch into a billion-dollar enterprise. Standing 6'3" with shoulders that filled his navy Tom Ford jacket perfectly, Merritt possessed the kind of presence that commanded boardrooms without effort. His dark hair, always impeccably styled, showed the first threads of silver at the temples, a mark of distinction rather than age. Women had always found him irresistible, drawn to the dangerous combination of wealth, intelligence, and emotional unavailability that seemed to pulse beneath his perfectly pressed exterior. "The Geneva office expects you Monday morning, sir," his assistant Caroline announced from the doorway, her tablet glowing with flight confirmations and hotel reservations. "Your penthouse lease here expires next Friday." Merritt nodded without looking up from the contract. Geneva meant expansion, a new market, fresh conquests in the luxury automotive sector. Most importantly, it meant distance from everything that had recently become complicated. The corner office of his Manhattan headquarters overlooked Central Park, where autumn painted the trees in shades of gold and crimson. He'd worked 16-hour days in this space for 3 years, building something that mattered to investors and industry magazines. Success had always been measurable: stock prices, profit margins, market share, simple mathematics. Marriage, he'd learned, operated by entirely different rules. "Pack everything," he told Caroline. "Ship what's valuable. Donate the rest." She hesitated. "Sir, what about the items from your apartment? The personal things." Personal things. The phrase felt foreign. Merritt owned art worth millions, wines that collectors would kill for, and technology that hadn't hit consumer markets. But personal? That suggested attachment, and attachment was weakness disguised as sentiment. "Handle it," he said simply. Caroline retreated, leaving him alone with the silence that had become his most reliable companion. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park below. Somewhere in this city, his life had split into before and after. Before the announcement that changed everything. After the door that closed with such finality he could still hear the echo. "Estu gravida." Even now, 3 months later, Delaney's voice carried the same mixture of joy and terror that had frozen his blood. She'd stood in their kitchen, one hand pressed against her still flat stomach, the other clutching a small white stick like it held the secrets of the universe. Her auburn hair had caught the morning light streaming through their apartment windows, creating a halo effect that made her look almost ethereal. Beautiful Delaney Rhodes. Now Easton, though for how much longer, he couldn't say. 30 years old, with eyes the color of sage and a smile that had once made him believe in possibilities he'd never considered. She was everything he wasn't: warm where he was cold, open where he was guarded, hopeful where he was pragmatic. He'd married her 18 months ago in a ceremony that felt more like a merger than a celebration. Not because he didn't care for her, he did, in the measured way he cared for his vintage Aston Martin or his Rolex collection. She was beautiful, intelligent and uncomplicated, the perfect accessory for a man building an empire. But pregnancy meant permanence. It meant decisions that couldn't be undone, and responsibilities that stretched beyond quarterly reports. It meant becoming someone he'd never intended to be. The memory of her face that morning still haunted his dreams. The way her expression shifted from radiant anticipation to crushing disappointment when he'd simply stared at her, calculating the implications like a business proposal, rather than celebrating the miracle she'd offered him. "You have certainty? This changes everything," he'd said, the words falling between them like stones. The light in her eyes had died so quickly he'd wondered if he'd imagined it entirely. She'd nodded slowly, carefully placing the pregnancy test on the marble countertop between them like evidence in a trial, where they were both defendant and jury. He'd left for the office that morning and returned to find her sitting at their dining room table, hands folded, waiting. No tears, no accusations, just a question that cut deeper than any blade. "Do you want this baby, Merritt?" The honest answer, the one that revealed exactly who he was beneath the expensive suits and careful reputation, had lodged in his throat like a confession he couldn't make. Because wanting meant risking everything he'd built on the foundation of emotional distance. Wanting meant becoming vulnerable to loss in ways that could destroy him. So he'd said nothing, and his silence had answered everything. Delaney had continued attending her appointments alone. She'd stopped sharing updates about the pregnancy, stopped asking for his opinions on baby names or nursery colors. She'd moved through their apartment like a ghost, present but absent, carrying their child while he carried on with business as usual. The day she left, he'd found no note, no explanation, no forwarding address. Just an empty closet and the faint scent of her perfume lingering in rooms that suddenly felt enormous and hollow. Now standing 40 stories above the city that had given him everything he'd thought he wanted, Merritt felt the familiar weight of success pressing against his chest. Geneva represented the ultimate achievement, a global empire that would cement his legacy in automotive history. So why did victory taste like ash in his mouth? His phone buzzed against the desk, displaying Caroline's text. "Car ready for airport whenever you are, sir." Merritt straightened his tie, grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door. Switzerland awaited, along with the promise of a future where the past couldn't follow. Behind him, the office fell silent except for the soft whisper of wind against glass and the distant sound of a city that never stopped moving forward. Would you have walked away from everything you'd built for a second chance at something you'd already lost? The town car glided through Manhattan traffic with the smooth efficiency Merritt had come to expect from everything in his carefully orchestrated life. His driver, Thomas, had been with him for 5 years, long enough to know that conversation was unwelcome during these journeys. The partition between them remained raised, creating a cocoon of silence that suited Merritt's current mood perfectly. His phone displayed 17 missed calls from his mother, 6 from his business partner Vincent, and 0 from the only person whose voice he found himself listening for in the spaces between his thoughts. Delaney had been gone for 3 months, and the silence where her presence used to be had grown into something living and hungry, consuming his concentration during board meetings and stalking him through the empty rooms of his apartment. The leather briefcase beside him contained his entire future: contracts for the Geneva expansion, architectural plans for his new European headquarters, and a first-class ticket to a life where the past 18 months could be filed away like a completed project. Clean, efficient, final. "Mr. Easton?" Thomas's voice crackled through the intercom. "There's been an accident ahead. We can take the tunnel route, but it'll add 20 minutes to JFK. "Do it," Merritt replied, settling back against the seat. 20 minutes meant nothing when you were running toward something instead of away from it. Or at least that's what he told himself. The car descended into the tunnel, artificial lights creating a rhythmic pattern against the windows. In the strobing illumination, he caught glimpses of his reflection, the sharp jawline that had graced magazine covers, the steel-gray eyes that had intimidated competitors and charmed investors. At 38, he looked like exactly what he was, a man who had conquered every challenge except the one that mattered most. His phone buzzed with a text from Vincent. Board meeting moved to Thursday. "Geneva office needs final signatures by Monday. You're really doing this?" The question mark at the end felt loaded with years of friendship and business partnership. Vincent had been the one to introduce him to Delaney at a gallery opening 2 years ago, and he'd been the one to witness the slow-motion destruction of their marriage from a front-row seat in their social circle. Merritt typed back, "Already done. New chapter starts now." But even as he sent the message, something cold settled in his chest. New chapters implied that old ones were finished, and he wasn't entirely certain that was true. Delaney had a way of existing in the spaces between his thoughts, appearing in the corner of his vision like a memory that refused to fade. She'd been different from the women who usually orbited his world. Where others saw his wealth and status first, Delaney had looked at him with curiosity, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle rather than position herself for advantage. Their first conversation had lasted 3 hours, moving from art to philosophy to the small revelations that people usually kept hidden behind social masks. "You collect beautiful things," she'd observed, studying a sculpture in his apartment during their 3rd date. "I appreciate quality," he'd replied, the standard response he gave to anyone who commented on his acquisitions. "But do you love any of them?" she'd asked, turning those sage eyes on him with an intensity that had made him feel suddenly exposed. The question had haunted him then, and it haunted him now as the car emerged from the tunnel into the gray afternoon light. Love was a luxury he'd never allowed himself, a weakness that successful men couldn't afford. His father had taught him that lesson early and often. Emotional attachments were vulnerabilities that competitors could exploit. Yet Delaney had somehow slipped past his defenses, not through manipulation or calculation, but through the simple act of seeing him as more than the sum of his achievements. She'd found the spaces where his armor was thinnest, and filled them with warmth he hadn't realized he was missing. The pregnancy had changed everything. Not because he didn't want children. He'd never considered the question deeply enough to form an opinion, but because her joy in that moment had revealed the depth of her expectations, the future she'd been imagining, that included him not just as a provider or partner but as a father. The weight of that trust had terrified him more than any business risk he'd ever taken. "Terminal 4, sir," Thomas announced as they pulled into JFK. Merritt gathered his briefcase and stepped out into the crisp October air. Around him, travelers moved with purpose, heading toward destinations that promised new beginnings or long-awaited reunions. He was neither running toward something nor returning to anyone. He was simply moving, because stillness had become unbearable. The first-class lounge welcomed him with the kind of anonymous luxury that had become his natural habitat. He settled into a leather chair overlooking the runway, where planes departed every few minutes carrying people toward futures they couldn't yet imagine. His phone buzzed with an email marked urgent from Caroline. The subject line read, "Personal items, shipping update." He almost deleted it without reading, but something made him pause. Personal items. What did that even mean in his world? He'd instructed Caroline to ship anything valuable and donate the rest. But now he found himself curious about what she'd considered worth preserving. The email contained a detailed inventory, his watch collection, several pieces of art, his wine cellar contents, and a small box marked miscellaneous personal effects. At the bottom, Caroline had added a note. "Found these items in your desk drawer. Wasn't sure about disposal instructions. Please advise." Attached were 3 photos. The first showed Delaney's reading glasses, the ones she'd worn while studying medical journals late at night. The second was a small potted succulent she'd brought to his office, claiming it would humanize the space. The third was a pregnancy test, tucked into a velvet jewelry box like something precious. Merritt stared at the screen, his coffee growing cold in his hand. He'd never seen the test after that morning in the kitchen. Delaney must have kept it, hidden it away like a secret or a promise. The fact that it had ended up in his desk drawer meant she'd placed it there deliberately, sometime before she left. A message hidden in plain sight, waiting for him to find it. Flight 847 to Geneva, now boarding first-class passengers. The announcement echoed through the lounge. Merritt remained seated, staring at the photo of a plastic stick that had once held the power to change everything. Around him, passengers gathered their belongings and headed toward gates that would carry them away from this moment, this choice, this crossroads. But he couldn't move, because suddenly the question wasn't whether he could escape the past, but whether he wanted to. The Geneva flight departed without him. Merritt sat in the empty first-class lounge, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as his escape route taxied down the runway and disappeared into the gray October sky. His phone had been ringing nonstop for 20 minutes. Vincent, the Geneva office, his mother again. But he couldn't bring himself to answer. The pregnancy test photo still glowed on his screen, a small plastic oracle that had somehow derailed his entire future. "Sir?" A uniformed airline employee approached hesitantly. "Are you feeling all right? You missed your boarding call." Merritt looked up from his phone, registering the concern in the young woman's eyes. When was the last time someone had asked if he was all right? When was the last time the answer would have been anything but the automatic "fine" that successful men were trained to give? "I'm reconsidering my destination," he said finally. The employee nodded professionally. "We can rebook you on tomorrow's flight, or if you prefer a different route." "No." The word came out sharper than intended. "I need to go home." Home. The word felt foreign in his mouth. He'd called many places home over the years. Boarding school dormitories, college apartments, luxury condos in 3 different cities. But none of them had felt like the apartment he'd shared with Delaney, where she'd left books half open on coffee tables and plants in every window, where the morning light caught her hair as she made coffee in one of his Columbia Law t-shirts. The ride back to Manhattan passed in a blur of tunnel lights, and Thomas's carefully maintained silence. Caroline had texted 17 times, each message more frantic than the last. The Geneva deal was worth $200 million. The board was asking questions. Stock prices were fluctuating based on rumors of his absence. None of it mattered. His penthouse apartment greeted him with the kind of pristine emptiness that luxury magazines featured in spreads about successful bachelor living. Every surface gleamed. Every piece of furniture sat at perfect angles. Every work of art hung in museum-quality lighting. It was gorgeous, expensive, and completely devoid of the warmth that had once filled these rooms. Merritt loosened his tie and walked to the kitchen, where granite countertops reflected the city lights like a mirror. This was where Delaney had told him about the pregnancy, standing near the island with her hand pressed against her stomach and hope shining in her eyes. This was where he'd failed his first test as a father before their child was even born. The refrigerator held bottled water, imported beer, and takeout containers from restaurants whose names he couldn't remember. When Delaney had lived here, it had been full of real food, ingredients she'd used to cook meals that filled the apartment with scents that made him want to come home instead of working until midnight. His phone buzzed with a call from Vincent. This time he answered. "Jesus Christ, Merritt, where the hell are you? Geneva's been calling every 10 minutes. They think you've lost your mind." "Maybe I have." Merritt sank onto the leather sofa that had cost more than most people's cars. "The deal's off, Vincent." Silence stretched across the line then. "Are you drunk? Because if you're not drunk, we need to discuss the minor detail of the $200 million you just flushed down the toilet." "It's just money. It's just—" Vincent's voice climbed an octave. "Okay, who are you and what have you done with my business partner? The Merritt Easton I know doesn't cancel billion-dollar expansions because he's having a bad day." Merritt closed his eyes, seeing Delaney's face in the darkness behind his lids, the way she'd looked at him that last morning, not with anger or tears, but with a resignation that had cut deeper than any argument could have. "She left me a pregnancy test," he said quietly. "What?" "Delaney. She hid a pregnancy test in my desk drawer before she left. Caroline found it when she was packing my things." He opened his eyes, staring at the city lights that had once represented conquest and now felt like a collection of strangers' lives. "She kept it, Vincent, like it meant something." Vincent's sigh was audible across the connection. "Merritt, I know you're going through something, but you can't destroy your entire career because your ex-wife left you a piece of plastic." "She's not my ex-wife." The words surprised him as much as they surprised Vincent. "We never filed papers. Never made it official." "Okay, fine, your estranged wife. The point remains. Do you remember what you said when you introduced us?" Merritt interrupted. "At that gallery opening?" Another pause. "No, not really. You said she was the first woman you'd met who looked at art the way I looked at business plans, like she was trying to understand what the creator was really trying to say." Merritt stood and walked to the window, pressing his palm against the cool glass. "She looked at me the same way, Vincent, like I was worth understanding. And now? Now I think she understood me better than I understood myself." He watched a helicopter circle the city below, its spotlight cutting through the darkness like a searchlight looking for something lost. "I spent 9 months watching her carry our child alone because I was too afraid to admit that I wanted something I couldn't control." The line went quiet for a long moment. When Vincent spoke again, his voice was gentler. "So what are you going to do about it?" That was the question, wasn't it? What did a man do when he realized he'd been living his life like a balance sheet, measuring success by what he could acquire rather than what he could become? How did you rebuild something you'd destroyed through neglect and fear? "I don't know," Merritt admitted. "But Geneva isn't the answer." After hanging up, he walked through the apartment that had once felt like home and now felt like an expensive tomb. In his study, he found the shipping boxes Caroline had prepared, each one labeled and organized with military precision. The box marked "Miscellaneous Personal Effects" sat on his desk, smaller than he'd expected. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper like precious artifacts, were the remnants of a life he'd been too blind to appreciate. Delaney's reading glasses, the succulent that had somehow survived on his windowsill despite his complete lack of attention, a ticket stub from a movie they'd seen on their second date, a photo of them at his company Christmas party, her hand resting on his chest as they danced, and beneath it all, nestled in a velvet jewelry box like an engagement ring, the pregnancy test that had changed everything. Merritt lifted it carefully, studying the small plastic window that had once displayed 2 pink lines. Such a simple thing to hold such enormous power. In his hands, it felt like holding a grenade with the pin already pulled. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Package delivered." Overnight Express. Merritt frowned, scrolling through his recent deliveries. He hadn't ordered anything, and Caroline handled all business shipments. But as he read the message again, something cold settled in his stomach. A package. Delivered tonight. From who? The envelope sat on his doorstep like an accusation. Merritt stared down at the simple manila package. No return address. Just his name written in handwriting he didn't recognize. The overnight delivery notification had been accurate. Someone had wanted him to receive this tonight. Immediately. As if timing mattered more than convenience. His hands trembled slightly as he carried it inside, setting it on the granite kitchen island where Delaney had once announced their pregnancy. The irony wasn't lost on him that every significant moment in his recent life seemed to orbit this same space, this same cold stone surface that reflected his face back at him, like a mirror he didn't want to look into. The envelope opened easily, containing a single photograph and nothing else. No note, no explanation, no demands or accusations, just an image that hit him with the force of a physical blow. Delaney sat in what looked like a hospital chair, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, exhaustion written in every line of her face. But it was a beautiful exhaustion, the kind that came from something profound and transformative, rather than merely difficult. She wore a soft pink hospital gown, and in her arms, wrapped in a white blanket, was a baby, their baby. Merritt's legs gave out, and he found himself sitting heavily on one of the kitchen stools, the photograph shaking in his hands. The child was impossibly small, with a shock of dark hair that looked exactly like his own and tiny fists that had escaped the blanket's confines. The baby's eyes were closed, face peaceful in the way that only newborns managed, as if they carried some secret knowledge about tranquility that the rest of the world had forgotten. But it was Delaney's expression that destroyed him completely. She gazed down at their son, and somehow, looking at the strong line of the baby's jaw even in sleep, Merritt knew it was a boy, with a love so pure and overwhelming that it seemed to radiate from the photograph itself. This wasn't the posed happiness of a maternity photo shoot. This was raw, unfiltered joy mixed with exhaustion, wonder, and something that looked almost like grief. She'd done this alone. Carried their child for 9 months, endured labor, held their son for the first time, all while he was arranging shipping containers and booking flights to Switzerland. While she was bringing their child into the world, he'd been running away from it. Merritt turned the photograph over with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The back was blank except for a hospital timestamp. 2 days ago. 2 days. His son was 2 days old, and he was just now learning of his existence. The magnitude of what he'd missed crashed over him like a wave. First breath, first cry. The moment when Delaney had held him for the first time and whispered whatever words mothers whispered to their newborns. The pediatrician's examination. The first feeding. The first night when new parents supposedly didn't sleep because they were too amazed by the miracle they'd created. He'd missed all of it, and Delaney had experienced all of it alone. His phone rang, Vincent's name flashing on the screen, but Merritt couldn't bring himself to answer. How could he explain that his entire world had just reshuffled itself around a single photograph, that the man who'd walked out of JFK Airport 3 hours ago no longer existed? The baby in the photo had his mother's delicate bone structure, but his father's strong chin. Merritt could see echoes of his own infant photos in the curve of the child's cheek, the way his tiny hand curled near his face. This was his legacy, his continuation, his chance at something that mattered more than profit margins or market expansion. And he'd almost missed it entirely. The realization hit him with crystalline clarity. Delaney hadn't sent this photograph to hurt him or to demand anything from him. She'd sent it because their son deserved to be acknowledged, to exist in his father's awareness, even if his father had chosen not to exist in his life. It was an act of grace disguised as documentation, a gift he hadn't earned but that she'd given anyway. Merritt studied every detail of the image, the way Delaney's hospital bracelet caught the light, the soft blanket that someone, probably her mother, had carefully tucked around the baby, the small window in the background where late afternoon sunlight suggested this photo had been taken yesterday, during visiting hours when fathers usually met their children for the first time. Fathers who were present, fathers who chose to be there. He thought about the boxes in his study, packed with the remnants of a life he'd abandoned, the pregnancy test hidden like a secret message, Delaney's reading glasses that had seen her through medical journals and baby books, the succulent that had somehow survived his neglect, just like the love she'd offered him, even when he couldn't return it. She'd been building something while he'd been calculating exit strategies. She'd been preparing for their future while he'd been planning his escape. And now their son existed in the world, breathing and dreaming, and completely unaware that his father was sitting in a luxury apartment, staring at his photograph like a man seeing sunlight for the first time. Merritt's reflection stared back at him from the granite surface, distorted and unfamiliar. The successful businessman who'd conquered every challenge except the one that mattered most. The man who'd collected beautiful things but had never learned to love any of them. The father who'd missed his son's birth because he'd been too afraid to stay and find out what kind of man he might become. But maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe 2 days wasn't an eternity. Maybe there was still time to become the person that tiny sleeping face deserved to call father. His phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. His name is Camden Merritt Easton, born October 17th, 3:47 a.m. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, perfect in every way. Camden. She'd given him Merritt's name as a middle name, even after everything that had happened between them. Even after he'd failed every test that mattered, she'd still wanted their son to carry part of his father with him. The second message came immediately after. St. Mary's Hospital, room 314. If you want to meet him. Merritt's hands moved before his mind could catch up, grabbing his keys and jacket. For the first time in 3 months, he knew exactly where he needed to be. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital buzzed overhead like electrical insects, casting everything in the harsh white glow that made even healthy people look sick. Merritt stood frozen in the elevator, watching the numbers climb. 2nd floor, 3rd floor, each ding bringing him closer to a moment he'd spent 9 months avoiding. His reflection in the polished steel doors showed a man he barely recognized. His usually perfect hair was disheveled from running his hands through it during the 20-minute drive across the city. His tie hung loose, his jacket wrinkled from gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. For the first time in his adult life, Merritt Easton looked exactly like what he was, terrified. The elevator opened onto the maternity ward, revealing a corridor lined with rooms where new families were beginning their stories. Soft lighting replaced the harsh fluorescence, and the walls were painted in soothing blues and greens, as if color alone could make the magnitude of birth and new life feel manageable. Room 314 was halfway down the hall, and with each step, Merritt felt the weight of every choice that had brought him to this moment. The decision to marry Delaney because she seemed like a safe bet rather than a great love. The retreat into work when she'd announced her pregnancy. The months of silence when he should have been preparing for fatherhood. The flight to Geneva that he'd almost taken, running from the most important moment of his life. He paused outside room 312, where through the partially open door he could see a young couple bent over a bassinet, their whispered conversations filled with wonder and exhaustion. The man, barely out of college by the look of him, held his partner's hand while she fed their baby, both of them looking like they'd discovered the secret to happiness. Merritt had been older than both of them combined when Camden was born, and yet he felt infinitely less prepared. Room 314's door was closed, but warm light leaked from underneath, suggesting life and wakefulness beyond. Merritt raised his hand to knock, then let it fall. What did a man say when he'd missed the birth of his own child? How did you apologize for abandoning someone during the most vulnerable moment of their life? Are you going to stand out here all night, or are you actually going to knock? The voice belonged to an older woman emerging from the room across the hall. Delaney's mother, Helen Rhodes. 62 years old with silver hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that had clearly been passed down to her daughter. Helen had never particularly liked Merritt. She'd tolerated him during family dinners and holiday gatherings, but her politeness had always carried an edge that suggested she saw through his carefully constructed facade. Tonight, that edge had been replaced by something harder. Mrs. Rhodes. Merritt straightened his shoulders, falling back on the formal manners that had carried him through 1,000 uncomfortable business meetings. I received Delaney's message. Did you? Helen's gray eyes, so much like her daughter's, studied him with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly disappointing specimen. Because I was under the impression that you'd already left for Switzerland. Something about a business opportunity that couldn't wait. The words hit like physical blows, each one precise and perfectly aimed. Helen Rhodes had never been subtle about her opinions, and she clearly saw no reason to start now. Things changed, Merritt said quietly. Things changed. Helen repeated the words like she was tasting something bitter. My daughter spent 43 hours in labor, Merritt. 43 hours. Do you know what that means? He didn't respond, sensing that any answer would only make things worse. It means she started having contractions on Tuesday night and didn't deliver until Thursday afternoon. It means she was alone for almost 2 days while her body was trying to bring your son into the world. Helen stepped closer, and despite being 8 inches shorter than him, somehow managed to make him feel small. She kept asking for you. Even after everything you'd put her through, she kept hoping you'd show up. The image hit him like a physical blow. Delaney in pain, scared, asking for someone who'd already mentally boarded a plane to another continent. His successful businessman's mind tried to calculate the logistics. If labor had started Tuesday night and the baby was born Thursday afternoon, that meant she'd been trying to reach him while he was finalizing contracts and packing his apartment. While his son was being born, he'd been choosing which artwork to ship to Geneva. "I didn't know," he said, the words inadequate even as he spoke them. "Of course you didn't know. You made sure you didn't know." Helen's voice carried the accumulated exhaustion of a woman who'd spent 2 days supporting her daughter through something that should have been shared with a partner. You want to know what she said when Camden was born? When the doctor placed him on her chest and she saw his face for the first time, Merritt found himself nodding, even though he was certain he didn't want to hear this. She said, "He looks just like his daddy." Not with anger, not with resentment, with love. Even then, after everything, she looked at that baby and saw you, and it made her happy. The words broke something inside him that he hadn't even realized was still intact. Here was proof of a grace he'd never deserved, love that had persisted despite his complete failure to earn it. Delaney had looked at their newborn son and seen the best parts of a man who'd given her every reason to see only the worst. "I want to meet him," Merritt said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "If she'll let me." Helen studied him for a long moment, and he had the strange sensation of being weighed and measured by standards he couldn't understand. Finally, she nodded toward room 314. "She's awake. Has been for the last 2 hours, staring at that photograph she had printed for you." Helen's expression softened slightly. "She still loves you, you know. God help her, but she does. The question is whether you're finally ready to love her back." Before he could respond, Helen Rhodes disappeared back into her room, leaving Merritt alone in the corridor with the weight of a question he'd been avoiding for 18 months. Through the thin walls, he could hear the soft sounds of a baby stirring, small cries and gentle hushing, the eternal conversation between mother and child that had been happening in hospital rooms since the beginning of time. His son was in there, possibly hungry or uncomfortable or simply adjusting to a world that was infinitely larger and stranger than the warm darkness he'd known for 9 months. Merritt took a deep breath, raised his hand, and finally knocked. "Come in." Delaney's voice carried through the door, softer than he remembered but unmistakably hers. Merritt's hand trembled as he turned the handle, stepping into a room that felt like stepping into another universe entirely. The space was dimmed to a warm glow, designed for rest and recovery. Delaney sat propped against pillows in the hospital bed, her auburn hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. She looked exhausted in the way that only new mothers could, drained but luminous as if some internal light had been switched on despite her body's obvious need for sleep. But it was the bundle in her arms that stopped Merritt's breath entirely. Camden was awake, his dark eyes startlingly alert for a 2-day-old, seeming to focus on nothing and everything at once. His tiny fist had worked free from the soft blue blanket, and as Merritt watched, Delaney gently guided it back under the warm fabric, with the practiced care of someone who'd already learned her son's habits. "You came," she said simply, without looking up from the baby. "I saw the photograph." Merritt remained by the door, uncertain whether he was welcome to come closer. "Delaney, don't." Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. "Don't apologize yet. Just come meet your son first." She looked up then, and the impact of her sage-green eyes hit him like a physical force. There was no accusation there, no anger, just a profound sadness mixed with something that looked almost like relief, as if she'd been holding her breath for 2 days, waiting to see if he would choose to be present for this moment. Merritt crossed the room slowly, each step feeling monumental. As he drew closer, Camden came into sharper focus. The dark hair that was definitely inherited from his father, the delicate features that echoed his mother's bone structure, the impossibly small hands that seemed too perfect to be real. Merritt's voice caught. "He's beautiful. He has your stubborn chin," Delaney said, and there was the ghost of a smile in her voice. "And my mother's impatience. He's been fussy since about midnight, like he's got places to be." Merritt found himself smiling despite the emotional turbulence in his chest, already showing leadership qualities, or control issues, Delaney replied, and this time the smile reached her lips. Wonder where he gets that from. The gentle teasing was so familiar, so reminiscent of the easy rapport they'd shared before everything became complicated, that Merritt felt something loosen in his chest. This was the Delaney who'd made him laugh during board meetings with perfectly timed text messages. The woman who'd seen through his carefully constructed walls and somehow decided he was worth the effort anyway. Can I? He gestured toward the chair beside her bed and she nodded. Sitting down brought him close enough to see every detail of his son's face. Camden's eyes were the deep blue-gray that most newborns had, but something in their shape reminded Merritt of his own baby photos. The curve of the child's ear was pure Delaney, but the strong line of his jaw was unmistakably Easton genetics. Would you like to hold him? Delaney asked quietly. Terror and longing warred in Merritt's chest. He'd held babies before, distant cousins, colleagues' children at company events, but this was different. This was his son, his legacy, his chance to either begin something beautiful or destroy it through inexperience and fear. I don't know how, he admitted. Neither did I 48 hours ago. Delaney shifted slightly, preparing to transfer the baby, support his head and neck. Everything else is instinct. The moment Camden settled into his arms, Merritt understood why people used words like miracle to describe birth. The baby was impossibly light and impossibly solid at the same time, warm and alive and completely dependent on the adults around him for everything. His son, this tiny person, was half of him, half of Delaney, and somehow entirely himself. Camden stirred slightly, making a small sound that wasn't quite crying but wasn't contentment either. Merritt found himself swaying gently, a motion that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. He likes that, Delaney observed. You're a natural. I missed everything, Merritt said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Your mother told me about the labor. 43 hours and I wasn't here. Delaney was quiet for a long moment, watching him hold their son. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. I know you were scared. I know this wasn't what you planned. It wasn't about planning. Merritt met her eyes, needing her to understand even if understanding couldn't undo the damage he'd caused. It was about, I spent my whole life believing that caring about something made you weak. That love was a liability successful people couldn't afford. And now? Camden chose that moment to open his eyes fully, looking directly at his father with the kind of unfocused intensity that newborns managed. Merritt felt something shift inside his chest, some fundamental reorganization of priorities that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the small life breathing steadily in his arms. Now I think I was an idiot, he said softly. A successful, wealthy, completely hollow idiot who almost lost the only things that actually matter. Delaney's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. I didn't send that photograph to manipulate you into coming back. I sent it because Camden deserves to exist in your awareness, even if you choose not to exist in his life. I want to exist in his life. The words came out stronger than he'd expected. I want to be his father, Delaney. Not just financially, not just legally, but actually. I want to teach him things and embarrass him at soccer games and worry about him when he starts dating. That's a beautiful thought, she said carefully. But wanting something and being capable of it are different things. Then teach me. He looked down at Camden, who had dozed off again with the easy trust that babies showed toward anyone who held them gently. I know I have no right to ask anything of you after what I've done, but teach me how to be what he needs. Delaney studied his face for a long moment, and Merritt had the sensation of being examined by someone who knew him better than he knew himself. Finally, she reached out and touched Camden's tiny hand, where it rested against Merritt's chest. He's going to need more than weekend visits and expensive toys, she said quietly. He's going to need someone who shows up, someone who stays when things get difficult. I want to be that person. Do you? Or do you want to be that person? Her question was gentle but precise, cutting straight to the heart of his uncertainty. Because those are very different things, Merritt. Before he could answer, Camden stirred in his arms, making the small huffing sounds that Delaney had learned meant he was getting hungry. The spell of the moment broke slightly, replaced by the practical reality of caring for a newborn. He needs to eat, Delaney said, reaching for the baby. As Merritt transferred Camden back to his mother, their hands brushed and the familiar electricity was still there. The connection that had drawn them together in the first place and had somehow survived everything that had tried to destroy it. But connection wasn't the same as trust. And trust, Merritt realized as he watched Delaney settle Camden for feeding, was something that had to be earned one choice at a time. 3 days later, Merritt stood in the baby section of Target at 7 in the morning, holding a shopping list written in Delaney's careful handwriting, and feeling more out of place than he had in any boardroom negotiation. Diapers, size newborn, formula, Similac, burp cloths, baby wipes, sleep sacks, 0 to 3 months. The items seemed simple enough until he faced an entire aisle of options he'd never known existed. Who knew there were 17 different types of baby formula, each promising different benefits he couldn't begin to understand? You look lost. The voice belonged to a woman about his age, pushing a cart filled with groceries and a toddler who was systematically destroying a box of crackers. She had the kind of practical beauty that came from someone who'd learned to prioritize function over form, her brown hair pulled back in a messy bun, and her clothes designed for comfort rather than impression. Completely, Merritt admitted, holding up the list. My son is 4 days old and apparently I know nothing about babies. First time? She asked, and when he nodded, her expression softened with understanding. It's overwhelming at first, but babies are simpler than the marketing wants you to believe. Here, she reached for a basic container of formula. This is what most pediatricians recommend unless there's a specific reason to use something else. Thank you. Merritt studied the container like it contained state secrets. I'm supposed to be intelligent. I run a multi-billion-dollar company. But apparently, that doesn't translate to understanding infant nutrition. The woman laughed, not unkindly. Different skill set entirely. I'm Dr. Ava Sinclair, by the way, pediatrician at Children's Hospital. Merritt Easton. He paused, wondering if she'd recognize the name from business publications, but her expression remained pleasantly neutral. And you're probably exactly the person I should be talking to. Probably, she agreed. Is Mom doing okay? 4 days postpartum can be rough. The simple question hit harder than it should have. Was Delaney okay? He'd spent the last 3 days trying to prove his commitment by handling practical tasks. Grocery runs, pharmacy trips, organizing the nursery that had sat untouched in their apartment for months. But had he actually asked how she was feeling? I think so, he said slowly. We're navigating some complications. Dr. Sinclair's expression suggested she'd heard variations of this story before. New babies have a way of revealing cracks in relationships that seemed solid before. But if you're here at 7 a.m. buying formula because she asked you to, that's a good sign. If only it were that simple. Delaney had asked him to shop for Camden not because she trusted him, but because she was testing him. Every request over the past 3 days had felt like an examination. Could he remember to buy the specific brand of diapers that didn't irritate newborn skin? Would he actually show up when he said he would? Could he handle the mundane, unglamorous reality of caring for an infant? So far, he'd passed the basic tests. He'd arrived on time, bought the right items, and learned to change diapers without looking like he was defusing a bomb. But he could feel Delaney watching him, waiting for the moment when his patience would wear thin or his business priorities would reassert themselves. The thing about new parents, Dr. Sinclair continued, selecting a pack of burp cloths and adding them to his cart, is that everyone expects them to know what they're doing instinctively. But parenting is a learned skill like any other. The only difference is that the stakes feel impossibly high because you're responsible for this tiny person who depends on you for everything. Merritt found himself thinking about Camden's impossibly small fingers, the way they'd gripped his thumb with surprising strength when he'd held him yesterday. Such a simple gesture, but it had felt like a promise, one that Merritt wasn't sure he was qualified to keep. What if you're not sure you have the right instincts, he asked. Then you learn, you pay attention, you ask questions. Dr. Sinclair's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with the expression of someone whose day was about to become much busier. But the fact that you're worried about doing it right means you probably will. After she left, Merritt finished his shopping in thoughtful silence. Each item on Delaney's list represented something Camden would need in the coming days. Sustenance, comfort, protection, basic necessities that somehow felt monumental when you were responsible for providing them. The drive back to Delaney's mother's house took him through neighborhoods he'd never paid attention to before. Tree-lined streets with modest homes, playground equipment visible in backyards, minivans parked in driveways with car seats and soccer ball stickers. This was where families lived, where children grew up riding bikes and playing in sprinkler systems, and learning that home was a feeling rather than an address. Helen Rhodes answered the door before he could knock, her expression as welcoming as a prison warden's. You're late, she said without preamble. Merritt checked his watch. By 3 minutes. Delaney's been timing you. She told Camden you'd be here at 8:30, and it's 8:33. Helen stepped aside to let him enter, but her disapproval filled the hallway like expensive perfume. She's in the living room trying to get him to nap. The Rhodes family home was everything Merritt's apartment wasn't. Comfortable, lived in, filled with photographs and books and the kind of accumulated memories that made a space feel truly inhabited. Delaney sat on a worn sofa, Camden cradled against her chest as she swayed gently back and forth. "How did it go?" she asked without looking up. "Successfully, I think." Merritt set the shopping bags on the coffee table. "Though I met a pediatrician who essentially told me I have no idea what I'm doing." "You don't," Delaney said matter-of-factly. "Neither do I. The difference is that I don't have a choice about learning." The words stung because they were true. Delaney was Camden's primary source of nutrition, comfort, and security. She couldn't opt out of midnight feedings or diaper changes or the constant vigilance that newborns required. Merritt's participation was voluntary, which made it both more meaningful and more fragile. "I want to learn," he said quietly. "Good, because he's going to need a bath later, and I'm going to teach you how to do it." The thought of bathing something so small and fragile filled Merritt with the kind of terror usually reserved for hostile takeovers. "What if I drop him? Then you'll catch him. Or I will." Delaney finally looked up, and her expression was softer than her words. "The point isn't to be perfect, Merritt. The point is to be present." Present. Such a simple concept, but one he'd been avoiding his entire adult life. Being present meant being vulnerable to disappointment, to failure, to the possibility that despite his best efforts, he might not be enough. Camden stirred against his mother's chest, making the small sounds that Merritt was learning meant he was transitioning between sleep stages. Such tiny communications, but somehow Delaney had already learned to interpret them like a private language between mother and child. "He's been asking for you," she said softly. "Asking? Babies have ways of communicating even when they can't talk. He's been restless when you're not here. Settles down when he hears your voice." Delaney adjusted Camden's position slightly. "I think he knows you're his father." The idea that Camden might somehow recognize him, might actually want his presence, felt like a gift Merritt hadn't earned. But perhaps that was the nature of love. It wasn't always deserved, just offered freely, and hoped for in return. "There's something else," Delaney said, her voice carefully neutral. "Vincent called. Something about Geneva and board meetings and damage control." Merritt's phone had been buzzing with calls and messages for 3 days, each one more urgent than the last. The Geneva deal was collapsing. Stock prices were fluctuating. His absence was creating exactly the kind of chaos that successful businessmen were trained to prevent at all costs. "I haven't answered," he said. "Maybe you should. This is your career we're talking about." He looked at her carefully, searching for hidden meaning in her words. Was she testing his priorities again? Giving him permission to return to the life he'd always known? Or genuinely concerned about the financial implications of his choices? "My career will survive," he said finally. "This won't happen again." What won't happen again? Missing the important moments. Missing Camden's first bath, his first smile, his first word. Merritt met her eyes directly. Missing the chance to be the father he deserves. Camden chose that moment to open his eyes, focusing on nothing and everything with the serious expression that newborns wore, like they were contemplating the mysteries of existence. For a brief moment, Merritt could have sworn his son was looking directly at him, as if evaluating whether this man could be trusted with something as precious as unconditional love. The answer, Merritt realized, was entirely up to him. The phone call came at 2:47 a.m., shattering the fragile peace of Merritt's first full night of sleep in a week. "Merritt?" Delaney's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "I need you to come over. Now." He was already reaching for his clothes before fully processing her words. "What's wrong? Is Camden okay?" "He won't stop crying. He's been screaming for 3 hours straight, and nothing I do helps." Her voice broke slightly. "My mother's at her bridge tournament in Atlantic City, and I don't know what to do. The pediatrician's answering service said to monitor him. But Merritt, something's wrong." 20 minutes later, Merritt stood in the Rhodes family living room, watching his son's face turn red with the effort of expressing whatever distress had consumed him. Camden's cries weren't the normal fussing Merritt had learned to recognize over the past week. This was something primal and desperate. The sound of a creature in genuine distress. Delaney paced the room with Camden pressed against her shoulder, her auburn hair disheveled and her eyes rimmed with exhaustion and fear. She'd changed into comfortable clothes, soft yoga pants and one of his old Columbia t-shirts that she must have kept after moving out. But even in casual wear, her distress was palpable. "He ate fine at 11, she said, her voice hoarse from trying to soothe him. "Had a normal diaper change, temperature's normal, but he just started screaming and won't stop." Merritt watched her move, recognizing the particular helplessness that came from being responsible for someone else's pain and having no way to fix it. This was parenthood stripped of sentimentality, the raw, terrifying reality of being trusted with a life you couldn't fully understand. "Let me try," he said quietly. Delaney hesitated for just a moment before transferring Camden to his arms. The baby's cries didn't diminish, but Merritt could feel the tension in his small body, muscles rigid with whatever was causing his distress. "Hey, buddy," Merritt murmured, settling into the rocking chair that had probably soothed Delaney when she was Camden's age. "What's going on? Talk to me." Camden's response was another wail that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his tiny lungs should have allowed. But as Merritt began to rock, something in the rhythm seemed to catch the baby's attention. The cries didn't stop, but they shifted slightly, becoming less frantic. "That's it," Merritt said softly, continuing the gentle motion. "I'm here. We're going to figure this out together." Delaney collapsed onto the sofa, watching them with the expression of someone who'd been carrying an impossible weight alone. "I thought I was doing something wrong. I thought maybe I wasn't feeding him enough or holding him right or—" "You're doing everything right," Merritt said firmly, never breaking the rocking rhythm. "Sometimes babies just need to cry. Dr. Sinclair told me that yesterday. Sometimes it's their only way of processing the world." "Dr. Sinclair?" "The pediatrician I met at Target. She said crying doesn't always mean something's wrong. Sometimes it just means they're overwhelmed." He adjusted Camden's position slightly, and the cries shifted again, becoming more tired than frantic. Like their nervous systems are too new to handle all the input. Camden's sobs began to slow, interrupted by small hiccups and the kind of exhausted breathing that followed intense emotional release. His tiny fist had worked free from the blanket and was pressed against Merritt's chest, right over his heart. "You're exhausted, aren't you?" Merritt said softly, looking down at his son's red, tear-streaked face. "Everything's new and loud and scary, and you don't know how to make sense of it all." The words could have applied to any of them in that moment. Merritt felt overwhelmed by fatherhood in ways that no business challenge had ever matched. Delaney was clearly struggling with the isolation of new motherhood, and Camden was trying to adjust to a world that was infinitely more complex than the warm darkness he'd known for 9 months. "He's settling down," Delaney observed, her voice soft with relief and something that might have been gratitude. "I think he just needed to know he wasn't alone." Merritt continued rocking even as Camden's breathing began to even out. "Maybe we all did." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the only sounds Camden's occasional hiccups and the steady creak of the rocking chair. Through the living room windows, Merritt could see the first hints of dawn beginning to lighten the sky, that soft gray time when night shifted toward morning and the world felt suspended between possibilities. "Merritt?" Delaney's voice was hesitant. "Thank you for coming. I know it's not your responsibility to—" "Stop." The word came out sharper than he intended, and Camden stirred slightly in response. Merritt lowered his voice. "He's my son. Being here isn't a favor I'm doing you. It's where I should be. Should be and want to be are different things. Not anymore." He looked at her directly, needing her to understand. "A week ago I would have sent a nanny, or transferred money to your account so you could hire help. I would have found a way to solve the problem without actually being present for it. And now?" Camden had finally fallen asleep, his small body completely relaxed against Merritt's chest. Such trust from someone so small, the assumption that the person holding him would keep him safe, no matter what. "Now I understand the difference between providing for someone and being there for them." Merritt's voice was barely above a whisper, careful not to wake the sleeping baby. "I've spent my entire adult life believing that money could substitute for presence. That success meant having enough resources to insulate yourself from inconvenience." Delaney drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them in a gesture that made her look younger and more vulnerable than he'd seen her in months. What changed? The answer should have been simple. Seeing Camden's photograph, holding his son for the first time, recognizing what he'd almost lost. But the truth was more complex than a single moment of revelation. "You did," he said quietly. "The way you looked at me when you told me about the pregnancy. Not with expectation or demand, just with hope that I might choose to be something better than I was." He adjusted Camden's blanket carefully. "And then the way you looked at me when I failed that test. Not with anger, but with this sadness that told me you'd really believed I might surprise you. I wanted to believe you could love something more than your own success. I was terrified of loving something I might lose. The admission came easier than he'd expected. Every relationship I'd ever had was transactional. Every connection came with an exit strategy. But this, he looked down at Camden, sleeping peacefully in his arms. You can't have an exit strategy with your own child. You can try, Delaney said softly. You were trying for 9 months. And I almost succeeded. Almost convinced myself that walking away was the rational choice. Merritt met her eyes. The Geneva opportunity was perfect because it was 3,000 miles away from having to figure out how to be a father. What happens now? Vincent's been calling you non-stop. The Geneva deal is dead. Has been since the moment I saw Camden's picture. He said it with such finality that Delaney blinked in surprise. I called Vincent yesterday and told him to terminate the contract. We'll take the financial hit and find other expansion opportunities. You can't just walk away from a $200 million deal because of one difficult night. I'm not walking away because of tonight. I'm walking away because I finally understand what I'd be walking toward. Merritt stood carefully, moving to place the sleeping Camden in the portable bassinet Delaney had set up in the corner. Geneva was about building an empire, but empires don't hold you when you're scared at 3 in the morning. As he settled Camden into the bassinet, the baby stirred slightly but didn't wake. His small chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of peaceful sleep, completely trusting that the adults around him would keep him safe while he was vulnerable. He looks like you when he sleeps, Delaney said softly. He looks like us, Merritt corrected, returning to sit beside her on the sofa, like the best parts of what we made together. For the first time in months, Delaney leaned against him, her head finding the space between his shoulder and chest that it had always seemed designed to fit. She smelled like baby powder and exhaustion and the lavender soap she'd used since college, familiar and comforting in ways that expensive cologne could never match. I'm scared, she whispered against his chest. Of what? That you'll get bored. That this will start feeling like work instead of love. And you'll find reasons to leave again. Her voice was barely audible. That I'll let myself believe in this, and then watch you disappear when it gets hard. Merritt wrapped his arms around her, careful not to wake Camden but needing her to feel the solidity of his presence. Then don't believe in me yet. Let me earn it. 2 weeks later, Merritt stood in his empty Manhattan apartment, surrounded by boxes in the echoing silence of a life being systematically dismantled. The Geneva deal wasn't the only thing he'd canceled. He'd also terminated his lease, put his art collection in storage, and instructed his real estate agent to find a family home in Westchester, somewhere with a yard and good schools and the kind of neighborhood where children could ride bikes safely. The apartment that had once represented the pinnacle of bachelor success now felt like a museum of choices he no longer understood. The minimalist furniture, the perfectly curated art, the kitchen that had never been used for actual cooking, all of it belonged to a version of himself that felt increasingly foreign. His phone buzzed with a text from Delaney. Camden smiled today. Real smile, not gas. Wish you could have seen it. The message was accompanied by a photo that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Camden, now 3 weeks old, lay on a soft blanket with his eyes bright and alert, the corners of his mouth turned up in what was unmistakably a smile. His dark hair had started to curl slightly, and his eyes were beginning to show hints of the steel gray that ran in the Easton family. Merritt had missed it. Despite spending most of the past 2 weeks at the Rhodes house, despite being present for midnight feedings and afternoon naps and the gradually increasing periods when Camden was awake and aware of the world around him, he'd been in meetings with lawyers when his son had smiled for the first time. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been signing papers to dissolve business partnerships and restructure his company around a more sustainable work-life balance, when Camden had reached his first major developmental milestone. "Sir?" Thomas appeared in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "The moving truck is here for the last load. Should I tell them to wait?" Merritt looked around the space that had defined his identity for 3 years. The floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Central Park, the mahogany desk where he'd built an empire, the bedroom where he'd slept alone more often than not, all of it would belong to someone else by tomorrow. "No, let them finish." He pocketed his phone and grabbed the single box he'd reserved for himself. "I have somewhere I need to be." The drive to the Rhodes house took him through familiar streets that seemed different now, as if becoming a father had adjusted the lens through which he saw everything. The luxury car dealerships and high-end boutiques that had once represented aspiration now looked like distractions from what actually mattered. The parks and playgrounds he'd never noticed before, suddenly seemed like the most important infrastructure in the city. He found Delaney in the backyard, sitting on a wooden swing with Camden against her chest, both of them enjoying the unseasonably warm October afternoon. She'd changed since leaving the hospital, not just physically, though she was clearly recovering her strength, but in ways that seemed deeper and more fundamental. There was a confidence in her movements now, the assurance of someone who'd discovered capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. "You missed it," she said without turning around, somehow sensing his presence. "I know. I'm sorry." He settled onto the swing beside her, close enough to see Camden's peaceful expression as he dozed against his mother's shoulder. "Tell me about it." He was lying on his changing table and I was making faces at him. You know, the ridiculous ones that adults do with babies. And suddenly her voice softened with wonder. He smiled back, not reflexive, not accidental. He was looking right at me, and he smiled because he was happy. Merritt felt the familiar pang of regret that had become his constant companion. Another first missed, another moment that belonged to the category of experiences that couldn't be recreated or recovered. "I took a video," Delaney added quietly, "if you want to see it." Later, he reached out to touch Camden's tiny hand, marveling again at the perfect miniature fingers that already showed signs of his own long, elegant shape. "I have news. About the company, about us, about what happens next." Merritt took a breath, recognizing that the words he was about to speak would fundamentally alter the trajectory of all their lives. "I sold my stake in the business." Delaney's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with shock. "You what?" "Vincent made an offer. A very generous offer to buy out my shares and take over as majority owner." Merritt kept his voice steady, though the magnitude of what he'd done was still settling in his own mind. "The paperwork was finalized this morning. Merritt, that company is your entire life. You built it from nothing. I built it instead of building anything else that mattered." He met her eyes directly. "The company will survive without me. Probably thrive, actually. Vincent's always been better with people than I am. But Camden won't get another chance to have his father present for his childhood." Delaney stared at him as if he'd announced he was joining the circus. "What are you going to do? You can't just retire at 38. "I'm not retiring. I'm pivoting." The business term felt inadequate for what was actually a complete reconstruction of his priorities. "I've been talking to some consulting firms about advisory roles. Things that would let me work from home, set my own schedule, be available for the important moments. And financially? We'll be fine. More than fine." He smiled at her obvious concern about practical matters. So typically Delaney to worry about logistics even in the middle of life-altering revelations. "The sale price was substantial. We could live comfortably without me working at all for the next 20 years. Camden stirred against Delaney's chest, making the small sounds that meant he was transitioning toward wakefulness. Soon he'd be hungry, or need changing, or simply want attention. The constant demanding rhythm of infant care that had become the organizing principle of their days. "This is about more than just being available for feedings and diaper changes," Delaney said carefully. "This is about fundamentally changing who you are." "No," Merritt said quietly. "This is about finally becoming who I actually am instead of who I thought I was supposed to be." Camden opened his eyes then, focusing on his father with the intent expression that newborns wore when they were trying to make sense of the world. For a moment, Merritt could have sworn his son was studying him, evaluating whether this man could be trusted with something as precious as unconditional love. "There's something else," Merritt said, never breaking eye contact with Camden. "I want to come home." "You don't have a home anymore. You said you terminated your lease." "I meant here, with you and Camden." He finally looked at Delaney, seeing his own vulnerability reflected in her sage-green eyes. "I want us to be a family. Not co-parents, not people who share custody of a child we both love. A family." Delaney was quiet for so long that Merritt began to wonder if he'd misread everything. The way she'd leaned against him during Camden's difficult night, the gradual thawing of her defenses over the past 2 weeks, the small moments of connection that had felt like forgiveness in progress. "I can't go back to the way things were before," she said finally. "I can't be the woman who makes herself smaller so you can feel bigger. I can't pretend your work doesn't matter as much as mine, or that my dreams are negotiable in ways that yours aren't. I don't want you to be that woman. I never wanted you to be that woman. I just didn't know how to be a man who deserved anything else." Merritt reached for her free hand, encouraged when she didn't pull away. "I want to be with the woman who challenges me to be better, who sees through my carefully constructed facade, who loves me enough to call me on my failures. And if it gets hard, If Camden gets sick or money gets tight or we have the kind of fight that makes you want to escape to Switzerland again, then we figure it out together. Because this, he gestured to encompass Camden, Delaney, the quiet backyard where they were having the most important conversation of their lives. This is what success actually looks like. Camden chose that moment to smile again, the real, intentional smile that Delaney had described. It started small, just a slight upturn of his lips, then spread across his entire face like sunrise breaking over a landscape. He was looking directly at Merritt when it happened, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment to offer his opinion on the conversation. "I think that's a yes," Delaney said softly, and there were tears in her voice. Merritt leaned over to kiss her forehead, then Camden's, sealing a promise that felt more binding than any contract he'd ever signed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, sleepless nights, financial adjustments, the daily work of building a life together, rather than simply sharing space. But for the first time in his adult life, he was choosing love over safety, presence over success, connection over control. And his son was smiling. 6 months later, Merritt woke to the sound of Camden's laughter echoing through the Westchester house they'd bought together. A sprawling colonial with a wraparound porch and enough bedrooms for the family they were still figuring out how to be. The sound was different from the cries that had punctuated those first terrifying weeks. This was pure joy, the kind of uninhibited delight that only children managed, untainted by self-consciousness or restraint. Camden had discovered his own hands the week before, and the fascination with his tiny fingers had provided endless entertainment for all of them. Merritt found them in the nursery, Delaney sitting cross-legged on the floor while Camden lay on his back on a soft quilt, batting at the mobile of wooden animals that hung above him. Sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked a backyard where Merritt had already planned a swing set, and maybe a vegetable garden. Domestic dreams that would have seemed impossible a year ago. "Good morning, troublemaker," Merritt said, settling beside them on the floor. Camden's response was a gurgle of recognition followed by more laughter as he managed to grab one of the mobile's dangling elephants. At 6 months old, he was beginning to show distinct personality traits, curiosity that seemed endless, a stubborn determination that definitely came from both parents, and a smile that could dissolve any argument between the adults in his life. "He's been up since 5, Delaney said, though her tone held no complaint. "I think he was waiting for his morning constitutional with Daddy." The morning constitutional had become their routine. Merritt would take Camden for a walk through the neighborhood while Delaney caught up on sleep or simply enjoyed an hour of solitude. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and it had become one of the anchors around which their new life was organized. "Vincent called last night," Merritt said, lifting Camden into his arms. "The Tokyo expansion is ahead of schedule. He wanted to thank me again for the consulting work on the design specs." "And how did that feel?" It was a question Delaney had learned to ask, not out of suspicion but out of genuine curiosity about his emotional adjustment to a life that bore no resemblance to his previous existence. The consulting work was fulfilling in ways that surprised him. He could contribute his expertise without the crushing responsibility of leadership, could solve interesting problems without sacrificing his presence at home. Good. Different, but good. Merritt adjusted Camden's position, marveling again at how natural it had become to hold his son, to anticipate his needs, to communicate in the wordless language that parents developed with their children. "I miss the adrenaline sometimes, the feeling of building something from nothing. But I'm building something here too, something that matters more than market share or profit margins." He looked around the nursery they'd decorated together, soft blues and greens, books already lining the shelves for when Camden was old enough to appreciate stories, photographs of 3 generations of family members who would help shape this child's understanding of love and belonging. Camden reached up to grab Merritt's nose, a new favorite game that never failed to make him laugh. Such a simple gesture, but it represented trust in its purest form, the assumption that the person holding him would never hurt him, would always keep him safe, would be there whenever he needed comfort or protection. "There's something I need to tell you," Delaney said, her voice carrying a note that made Merritt look at her more carefully. She was sitting with her knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them in the gesture he'd learned meant she was processing something significant. Her auburn hair had grown longer since Camden's birth, and she'd started wearing it down more often, softening the professional severity she'd maintained during her medical training. "What is it?" "I got a call yesterday, from Children's Hospital in Manhattan." She met his eyes directly. "They're offering me a position in their pediatric oncology department. It's what I've been working toward since medical school." Merritt felt something cold settle in his stomach. Children's Hospital was in the city, an hour commute each way even without traffic. It would mean long hours, demanding cases, the kind of career commitment that didn't leave much room for the domestic life they'd been building. "That's incredible," he said, and meant it despite his concerns. "You've earned this." "Have I? I've been out of residency for 8 months, taking care of Camden, figuring out how to be a mother. Part of me wonders if I'm even the same doctor I was before." "You're better," Merritt said without hesitation. "You understand things about healing and caring that you couldn't have learned from textbooks. Those children will be lucky to have you." Camden started to fuss slightly, the precursor to hunger that they'd both learned to recognize. Delaney reached for him automatically, and Merritt watched the seamless transition that still amazed him, the way she could comfort their son with nothing more than the familiarity of her voice and touch. "The position starts in 3 months, she said as Camden settled against her for feeding. "Full-time, with the possibility of research opportunities down the line. Everything I thought I wanted, thought you wanted, I don't know anymore. 6 months ago, career advancement was the most important thing in my life. Now," she looked down at Camden, who had found his rhythm and was nursing contentedly. "Now I understand why people say having children changes everything. It's not just that you love them, it's that loving them reorganizes your entire understanding of what matters." Merritt moved to sit behind her, wrapping his arms around both of them in a gesture that had become natural over the months they'd been rebuilding their relationship. The three of them fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had finally found its proper configuration. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to take the job, and I want to be present for Camden's first steps and first words and all the moments that happen when you're not looking." She leaned back against his chest. "I want to be the kind of mother who doesn't miss the important things, and the kind of doctor who makes a difference. I just don't know if it's possible to be both. We'll figure it out," Merritt said, the words coming easily because they'd become the foundation of everything they'd built together. "We'll hire help when you need it, and I'll adjust my consulting schedule, and we'll make mistakes and learn from them just like we've been doing since Camden was born." "You really mean that? You won't resent the chaos or the lack of flexibility, or the times when work has to come first?" "Delaney," he turned her gently so she could see his face. 6 months ago, I would have seen your career as competition for your attention. I would have calculated how your success might impact my comfort, my priorities, my carefully controlled life. And now? Now I understand that watching you become everything you're capable of being is part of loving you. Camden deserves to see his mother pursuing her dreams, not sacrificing them. Merritt touched his son's tiny hand, which had escaped from his blanket and was resting against Delaney's chest. "And I want to be the kind of father who shows him that love means supporting the people you care about, in becoming their best selves." Camden finished eating and immediately fell asleep, the kind of instant unconsciousness that only babies managed. Delaney shifted him to her shoulder for burping, and Merritt found himself thinking about the life they were creating together. Messy and unpredictable and nothing like the controlled existence he'd once thought he wanted. "I love you," Delaney said quietly, the words offered like a gift rather than an obligation. "I love you too, both of you." He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with baby powder and the indefinable sweetness that seemed to cling to everything in Camden's orbit, more than I knew was possible. Outside, the neighborhood was coming to life, children walking to school, parents heading to work, the ordinary rhythm of families beginning another day. Soon Camden would be old enough to join that flow, to ride bikes and play in yards and learn that home was both a place and a feeling. But for now, in the quiet nursery filled with morning light and the sound of their son's peaceful breathing, they had everything they needed. Not the life either of them had planned, but the life they'd chosen together. Imperfect and demanding and more beautiful than any success Merritt had ever achieved in a boardroom. Camden stirred slightly in his sleep, his small fist opening and closing as if he were grasping for something just out of reach. Without thinking, Merritt offered his finger, and Camden's hand closed around it, with the automatic trust that had become the organizing principle of all their days. Holding on, being held, choosing to stay when staying was difficult. This was what family meant. This was what love looked like when it stopped being theoretical and became the daily practice of showing up for the people who needed you most. And finally, for the first time in his life, Merritt Easton was exactly where he belonged. 3 years later, the sandbox in their backyard had become the center of Camden's universe, and by extension, the center of theirs. Merritt sat on the wooden edge watching his 3-year-old son construct what appeared to be either a castle or a space station. With Camden, the distinction was often unclear. The boy had inherited his father's attention to detail and his mother's creative imagination, resulting in elaborate architectural projects that required serious discussion about structural integrity and the proper sand-to-water ratio. "Daddy, look." Camden held up a plastic bucket filled with perfectly molded sand. "It's a tower for the Dragon Princess. The Dragon Princess needs a very tall tower," Merritt agreed solemnly, having learned that Camden's stories required respectful attention to their internal logic. "Is she trapped or is she the one doing the trapping?" Camden considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice. "She's protecting the treasure, but she's nice to good guys." "Ah, a discerning Dragon Princess. Very wise." Through the kitchen window, Merritt could see Delaney preparing lunch, still wearing her hospital scrubs from the morning shift at Children's Hospital. 3 years into her position in pediatric oncology, she'd found her rhythm, working 4 days a week, with Fridays reserved for research and family time. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. The compromise had required adjustments from both of them. Merritt had restructured his consulting business to be completely remote, turning their home office into a space where he could advise automotive companies across 3 continents without missing Camden's afternoon naps or evening bedtime stories. Some days were harder than others. Client calls during sandbox time, Delaney getting home late from difficult cases, but they'd learned to bend without breaking. "Merritt," Delaney called from the kitchen. "Can you bring Camden in? Lunch is ready and we have news to discuss." News. In their household, that could mean anything from Camden's preschool teacher wanting to discuss his tendency to reorganize the classroom toy bins to Delaney being offered another research opportunity. Merritt had learned to approach news with cautious optimism. "Come on, Dragon Princess Protector," he said to Camden. "Time for sustenance." Camden abandoned his construction project with the easy adaptability of childhood, racing toward the house with the boundless energy that had replaced infant sleepiness. At 3, he was all motion and questions and observations that sometimes left his parents speechless with their unexpected wisdom. The kitchen smelled like grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, comfort food that had become their Saturday tradition. Delaney had changed out of her scrubs into jeans and one of Merritt's old sweaters. Her hair pulled back in the messy bun that usually meant she was processing something significant. "What's the news?" Merritt asked, lifting Camden into his booster seat. "2 pieces, actually." Delaney served lunch with the efficient movements of someone who'd mastered the art of feeding a family while managing multiple thoughts. "Good news first. My research proposal was accepted. The childhood leukemia study I've been working on for 2 years is getting full funding." "Delaney, that's incredible." Merritt felt the familiar surge of pride that came with watching his wife achieve goals she'd been pursuing since before they'd met. "How long is the study period?" 3 years, with the possibility of extension. "It means more travel, some conference presentations, probably some late nights analyzing data." She sat down across from them, her expression carefully neutral. "It's everything I've been working toward professionally." "Mama's gonna help sick kids," Camden announced around a mouthful of sandwich. "That's good." "Yes, it is good," Merritt agreed, studying Delaney's face for signs of whatever complexity lay beneath her careful composure. "What's the second piece of news?" She reached across the table to take his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in the gesture that had become their shorthand for significant moments. "I'm pregnant." The words hit him like a physical force, and for a moment Merritt was transported back to that kitchen in their old apartment, to Delaney's hopeful face and his own paralyzing fear. But this time, the fear was different. Not the terror of unwanted responsibility, but the natural anxiety of someone who understood exactly how precious and fragile new life could be. "Pregnant," he repeated, needing to hear the word aloud to make it real. "About 10 weeks. I wanted to wait until after the first trimester to say anything, but with the research study starting," she squeezed his hand. "The timing is complicated." Camden looked up from his soup, processing the conversation with the seriousness he brought to all adult discussions. "Baby?" he asked. "Yes, sweetheart," Delaney said softly. "You're going to be a big brother." Camden's response was a whoop of excitement that nearly knocked over his cup. "Can I teach the baby about dragon princesses?" "I think the baby would love that," Merritt said, his voice rougher with emotion than he'd expected. A second child. Another tiny person who would depend on them for everything, who would reorganize their carefully constructed balance and force them to grow in ways they couldn't anticipate. The thought should have terrified him. 3 years ago, it would have sent him reaching for his phone to check flight schedules to distant cities. But now, watching Camden's excitement and seeing the cautious joy in Delaney's eyes, he felt something entirely different. Hope, anticipation, the kind of overwhelming love that made fear seem insignificant by comparison. "We'll figure it out," he said, the words that had become their family motto. The research study, the new baby, Camden's adjustment to being a big brother. "We'll figure all of it out together." "Are you sure? Because this time you know what you're signing up for." Sleepless nights, diaper changes, the complete upheaval of any schedule we've managed to establish. Merritt stood and walked around the table to pull her into his arms, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and the lingering antiseptic smell from the hospital that had become as much a part of her as her laugh. 3 years ago, when Camden was born, "I thought love was a finite resource," he said quietly, "that caring about one thing meant having less to give to everything else. But watching you love him, watching him love us back, I've learned that love doesn't divide, it multiplies." Even with the research study, the travel, the irregular hours, especially with the research study, Camden needs to see his mother changing the world, and our new baby needs to be born into a family where both parents are becoming the best versions of themselves. Delaney pulled back to look at him, and he could see the moment when her carefully maintained control cracked slightly, revealing the joy she'd been protecting behind practical concerns. "I love you," she whispered. "All of you. This complicated, beautiful, impossible family we've built. I love you too. All of you." He rested his hand on her still flat stomach, marveling at the life growing there, even the one we haven't met yet. Camden, who had been following the conversation with the intense focus he brought to all important family discussions, suddenly stood up in his booster seat. "Group hug," he announced, launching himself into their embrace with the fearless trust that had defined his relationship with the world since birth. They stood there in their kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of lunch dishes and Camden's sandbox sand tracked across the floor, holding each other, and the promise of the family they were still becoming. Through the window, Merritt could see the backyard where Camden would soon teach a younger sibling about dragon princesses and proper castle construction. The swing set he'd installed last spring, the vegetable garden that had produced exactly 3 tomatoes and endless pride, the oak tree where they'd hung a rope swing that Camden insisted was actually a ship's rigging. This was what success looked like, not the clean lines of a corporate office or the impressive numbers on a financial statement, but the beautiful mess of people choosing to love each other through every ordinary and extraordinary moment. "Daddy?" Camden's voice was muffled against his chest. "When the baby comes, can we build it a sandbox too?" "I think that's an excellent idea," Merritt said, imagining 2 children playing in the backyard, fighting over plastic buckets and creating elaborate fantasy worlds in the sand. "We'll build the best sandbox in the neighborhood. With a moat. Definitely with a moat." Delaney laughed, the sound bright with happiness and the particular exhaustion that came from loving people more than you'd ever thought possible. "Our children are going to be so spoiled. They're going to be loved," Merritt corrected. "There's a difference." Later that evening, after Camden had been tucked into bed with stories about brave dragon princesses and promises that they would start planning the new baby's sandbox tomorrow, Merritt and Delaney sat on their front porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood where they'd chosen to build their life together. "Do you ever miss it?" Delaney asked. "The old life? The excitement? The travel? The feeling of being important in ways that quarterly reports could measure?" Merritt considered the question seriously, thinking about the man he'd been before Camden's birth had reorganized his understanding of everything that mattered. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it," he said finally, "when success was just a number that went up, and the only person I had to worry about disappointing was myself. But I wouldn't trade this for anything, not for all the Geneva deals in the world." He reached for her hand, finding it exactly where he'd expected it to be. "I've learned that the most important things in life can't be measured in spreadsheets or planned in 5-year strategies. They happen in moments like this, with people you love, in places that feel like home." A few houses down, they could hear the sound of other families settling into their evening routines, children being called in from yards, dinner conversations drifting through open windows, the comfortable sounds of people who had chosen to build their lives around connection rather than achievement. "I'm scared," Delaney admitted quietly, "about managing everything. The research study, a new baby, Camden's needs, our relationship. What if I can't be everything to everyone? Then we'll adjust. We'll ask for help. We'll make mistakes and learn from them and forgive ourselves for not being perfect. Merritt pulled her closer, marveling again at how natural it felt to be the person others leaned on, instead of the person who stood alone. The only thing that would scare me is if you tried to be less than you are because you thought it would be easier. Promise me something? Promise me that if it gets hard, when it gets hard, you won't start looking for exits. That you'll remember this conversation and this feeling and choose us again. I promise, he said, and meant it with every cell in his body. Every day, for the rest of my life, I choose us. Above them, the first stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky. The same stars that had been there the night Camden was born, the night they'd almost lost each other to fear and misunderstanding. But they were different people now. Not perfect but present. Not fearless but faithful to the love they'd built together, one choice at a time. Somewhere inside the house, Camden was dreaming about dragon princesses and baby siblings and sandbox kingdoms, where anything was possible. Soon there would be another child dreaming in the room they would prepare together, another little person who would depend on them to create a world where love was abundant and safety was guaranteed. It was a responsibility that would have terrified Merritt Easton 3 years ago, but the man he'd become, husband, father, protector of dreams and builder of sandboxes, couldn't imagine wanting anything else. Come on, Delaney said, standing and pulling him toward the door. Let's go check on our dragon princess protector and start planning how we're going to change the world. Together? Always together. And as they walked into their house, filled with the toys and books and comfortable chaos of a family that was still becoming what it was meant to be, Merritt understood that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for his entire life, without ever knowing he was looking for it. Home. Not a place, but a choice. Not a destination, but a daily practice of showing up for the people who needed him most. Behind them, the porch light illuminated the swing where they'd sat through countless conversations about dreams and fears, and the beautiful uncertainty of building a life together. Tomorrow, there would be new challenges, new joys, new moments that would test and strengthen the foundation they'd laid. But tonight, they had everything they needed. Love that had survived its own destruction and grown back stronger. A child who believed in dragon princesses and the power of well-built sandboxes, and the promise of another small miracle growing quietly in the space between what they'd planned and what they'd been blessed to receive. Would you have had the courage to choose love over safety, presence over success, and the beautiful uncertainty of family over the controlled predictability of a life built around achievement? In a world that often measures worth by what we accumulate rather than who we become, sometimes the greatest success is learning that the most important things in life can't be bought, planned, or controlled. They can only be received with open hearts and protected with daily choices to stay, to love, and to build something together that's greater than anything we could create alone. Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.